Hello guys and welcome back to my channel. Today is a great day because I have finally finished building the first part of the ultimate blog application created using only Node.js and nothing more. This is not an Express.js tutorial, a MERN stack tutorial, a min stack tutorial. Here we use pure JavaScript to do everything is needed to build our application. If you follow this tutorial step by step, you will be capable to create pretty much every application you want. So, what you will learn in this tutorial? You will learn how to manage CRUD operation using the Node.js FS module. CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update and Delete. You will learn how a client exchanges data with your Node.js server, how to manage data stream, how to manage HTML form. You will learn a bunch of JavaScript concepts that you can reuse along with every your project and much more. So, what we are waiting for? Let's go to build our blog application. Before we start to write some code, we must create all the project folders. I like to divide the server related files from others. So, first of all, we must create a server folder and a public folder. So, server and a public folder outside. Public. Okay. We will need also a database folder and a template folder. So database folder and a templates folder. In the first one, we will store our application data, while in the second one, we will store all the HTML templates. Our server doesn't exist yet, so I think that the best way to start is to make it able to understand HTML file and all related files like JavaScript file and CSS files. After that, we will build some server-side logic for our blog application. So, let's start to create our server.js file and write inside of it the basic scaffolding we need to make it work. I will go straight during the typing only for time reasons, but don't worry, I will explain line by line in a moment. If we slide down the code here, we will see that we've imported all the dependencies and have created the server object container. If you are unfamiliar with object-oriented programming, this is a very useful way to divide our code and make it reusable by invoking the object key. As a first step, we use the HTTP createServer method, which accepts two arguments, a request object and a response object. The request object is what we use to grab data from the client request. The response object is what we use to send data back to the client. Now let's get into what's happening here. Here we grab the request URL and we use it to build the URL object. The URL API is a JavaScript built-in API, so you don't need to import any modules. Through a regex rule, we clean the path from forward slashes after extracting the path from the URL object. The search param property on the URL object allows us to extract all the query parameters from it and transform them into a string by using the toString method. Here we are doing nothing else except to transform the search param string into an object. This function does not exist yet, so let's build it together. So let's create a new file named helpers.js. Not here, but inside the server folder. Helpers.js. Okay. First of all, we start by creating the helpers container and exporting it like a module. So, create the container that helpers is equal to an empty object and module.exports is equal to helpers. Helpers. Okay. After that, we can build our function. So let's see what's happened here. I have created an empty object that will be our function output. By passing the URL string into our URL search param interface, we can manipulate the keys stored inside our string and store them inside our empty object through a for each loop and the getter method. If you're unfamiliar with the ternary operator, maybe you don't understand what's happening here. The ternary operator allows us to declare some condition and accept some value if the condition is respected, or give back a default value if the condition is not respected. Here, basically, we are saying if this condition is respected, then I want this, otherwise I want that. So if we want to check if this function works properly, let's try to build some little query string. So let some random query will be a string. So name is equal to kung fu coding and tutorial is equal to blog application and, for example, follow. Yes. Okay, let's try to pass this string inside our parse params function. So console log helpers dot parse params. Okay, some random query. Let's try to run our file. So node, we are inside the server folder, and helpers.js, and as you can see, our function gives back an object with key and value as we have in our some random query strings. So now let's go back in our server.js file. So first of all, we need to link our helpers.js file with our server.js file because we want to use our parse param function. So we can say const helpers is equal require helpers. In this way, we have imported the helpers.js files like a module inside our server.js file. Let's go ahead to explain our server.js file. At this point, we have a query string object containing all the query parameters of our URL. After that, we have a query method variables that contain the request method. The only things that we are doing here is to transform to lowercase our request method. Here we store the request header inside a variable, and here we initialize the string decoder module. But why do we need to use this module? The answer is that we have to manage buffers. So before we understand the string decoder, we need to understand buffers. To properly explain this topic, we should make a separate video, but I will try to do it in just 1 minute. So every time that some data need to pass from client to server and from server to client, buffers come to play. Basically, it's a temporary memory allocation that contains the data we want to exchange between client and server. When you store data inside a physical temporary memory, you cannot think at those data like other data because you are interfacing with a piece of your computer hardware that only understands a very basic kind of data. And guess what data I'm talking about? Bytes. So we use buffers to represent a fixed length sequence of bytes, and we decode that data representation with our string decoder module. For your understanding, we can do a very quick example. Let's comment on our server.js file, our server function for a moment. So let's comment this function. And before we start our little example, I forgot to import the buffer class from the Node.js buffer module. So const buffer equal to require buffer dot buffer. Okay, because we want to take the buffer class from the buffer module. As the Node.js docs said, while the buffer class is available within the global scope, it's still recommended to explicitly reference it via an import or require statement. After that, let's try to console log out our buffer. So here we can say console.log, and we can call the buffer class. Maybe we want to from, okay, we want to use the from method. Okay, we can insert our string here, so hello world. And if we don't insert any encoding format, the output will be encoded with the UTF-8 encoding format. So let's try to console log out in this way. So terminal, new terminal. We need to say node server.js, and as you can see, we have a sequence of number and letters which represent our strings. If we want to insert an encoding format, we can do like so, comma, we can choose like base64. If we want, we can save, and now we can do CLS and node server.js, and as you can see, we have in another encoding format the same representation of our strings, but maybe it's word. Okay. So for example, let's say that we want to decode our new buffer to obtain the original string. We can do like so. Let the decoder is equal to new string decoder, and here we want to pass the encoding type UTF-8. Here we want to do exactly the same. Okay, and we want to console log decoder dot write, and we want to pass our buffer. Let's save, and let's say node server.js, and as you can see here, the result of this console log is exactly our string that we insert here. Let's continue with our server.js file. First of all, we need to get rid of all these things, and we need to comment out our server function. Okay, let's save our server.js file, and now we can continue to analyze our server.js file. Now that we understand what are buffers and why we need to use the string decoder module, it's easy to understand what's going on here. We are binding the request object a data event, and we grab the data we receive from our client, and we write this data on our buffer variables using the decoder modules. Since we are sending data from client to server, we need that our server understands when the data stream is finished. So we need to bind on the request object a new end event, and we need to use the decoder end method to make our buffer string ends. After that, we build the data object, and we store inside this object all the variables that we have stored before. So we have the cleaner path that it's here, we have the query stream object, we have the method, we have the headers, and we have the payload. The only difference between the example before is that we are using the base64 encoding type, And we are doing like so because we want to pass image data from our client to our server, and using the UTF-8 encoding type will make us lose a lot of the image's data, and we are not able to open the image after that we have saved it on our server. If we take a look at our payload value inside our data object, we can notice that we have a function that we have not built yet. Basically, this function parses JSON strings into JSON object, and the reason is, as we said before, that our string decoder gives us a data string. So let's build together this function. We go on the helpers.js file. So we can say helpers parse JSON to object is equal to a function. We want that this function will take a string, so let's say string. Okay, so we can wrap this function inside a try catch block. So try catch here. We do that because if during the parsing we meet some error, we return an empty object and our server will not crash. So return an empty object. Otherwise, we want to do let object is equal to json.parse. We want to pass inside this function our string, and we want to return our object. To make you understand better, we can do a little example. So we can say, for example, let string to parse is equal to, okay, a string as a JSON format. So we can say name Kung Fu coding application is a blog application, and for example follow. Yes. Okay. If we try to parse this string, we can say console.log helpers pass JSON to object, and we can pass our string to parse. If we open a new terminal and we say node server helpers.js, and as you can see here, our string has been parsed into a JSON object. Maybe this is the same of this string, but if we want to say here yes, we can try to do the same. So node server helpers.js, and as you can see here, we have yes. Now that we've built our data object, we must dwell on one last fundamental step, our router handler, this one. As we said before, we are declaring this variable using the ternary operator. So let's look for a moment at what's going on here. In short, this is the router of our website routes. So first of all, let's go to create our router object in order to make you understand better. Let's go over here. We need to create our router object, and we can say server.router is equal to an empty object. Okay. Inside this object, we will store all the functions with which we want to handle every route on our website. So basically, our router handler works as a function selector. For example, we can program our server behavior when a user goes on our index page, like so. We can say empty string, colon, And we can write here a function that will be triggered when our server object router key will be invoked inside our router handlers. But how does it work exactly? This is possible thanks to our cleaned path variable that stores a string that contains the URL path. So we can say handlers dot index, okay. So inside this function we can decide what kind of data our server will send back to the browser for our index view. And if we want to send back some text, how do we display plain text that come from our server on our browser? To achieve this goal, we have to be clear in mind the entire data flow. So let's try to analyze it together and try to build together all the missing pieces. So first of all, we need to create another file here that we will call handlers.js, and we can do here the same things we had done before with our helpers.js file. So we need to create our container. So create the container, let handlers will be an empty object, and we will export this empty object like a module, okay, and we will link this handler inside our server.js file. So const handlers is equal to require handlers, okay. Now here we can build our index function. So we can say handlers dot index is equal to async function, and we want to, for example, return status code of 200, a payload that say text, and a content type like plain, okay. And we want to create also the 404 handlers. So handlers dot not found is equal to an async function, and here we can return a status code like 404, we can return a payload like not found page, and a content type like plain. Okay, if we go back in our server.js file, basically we have all set up to start. We need only to invoke the listen method to make our server works. So we can say here server.init is a function. Okay, we can say server.http server.listen. We can pass our port and a function, and we can write console log server listening on port, and we can pass here the port. Okay, now we only need to call our server init function, so server init. Okay, if we open a new terminal and we write node server.js, as you can see here, we have listening on port 3000. If we open a new terminal here and we open our local host on port 3000, we can see here that we have just displayed a text string. So if we go on our inspect tool and we go on the network tab here, as you can see here, we have a text plain content type, okay, and we have a 200 status code. If we try to type on our URL search bar a path name that we have not included in our server.router object, you can see that our server gives us back the 404 page. If we open the inspect tool and we go on the network tab and we reload the page, you can see that here we have a 404 code and we have as well a content type text plain. Let's go back to our server.js file. Since I'm tired to type the path of the folder to start our server, I want to create an Index.js file and link inside of it our server.js file. Before that, we need to export our server.js file as the other modules. So at the end, we can get rid of this server init and we can say module.export is equal to server. Here in the main folder we need to create an Index.js file. Inside this Index.js file we can say const server is equal to require server okay. Now we can create the app container, so create the app container. So let app is equal to an empty object and we can say app.init is equal to is equal to a function, and we want to pass here our server.init function. Okay. After that, we only need to initialize our app.init function and to export the module. So module.export is equal to app. Now we can achieve the same goal only typing node index.js, and as you can see here we have the same results, and if we open our browser here we can see that the server is still running. Now we can finish analyzing our server.js file. Since inside our public folder we will store all the front-end application assets, we need that our server loads these static assets independently from what we asked inside our server router object. To achieve this goal, we have simply to check if the path contains the public substring and return the public handler if the condition is respected. Otherwise, give back what we have inside our router object. The main server function simply manipulates the payload based on the content type and gives it back to the client. Since we are using a synchronous function, we need to grab data from promises, so we have to build a function that do that for us and pass those data inside our main server function here. For your better understanding, we can console log out some data. For example, we can console log out our data stream. So for example, we can say here console log data stream. Okay. If we save and we open a new terminal, we can say node index.js and we refresh our server page. So Okay, if we go back in our terminal, as you can see here, our data stream has been console log out, and as you can see, is exactly what we have inside our handlers.index functions. If we go on our server and we say a page or a route that does not exist on our server router object, and we go back in our terminal, as you can see here, we can see our data stream. Another example that we can do is to console log out the data we gather from the client requests. So for example, here we can pass the data, okay, and here we can console log out the data we grab from our clients. So for example, if we restart the server, CLS, node, Index.js, and we go on our server, we need to go on our home page, and as you can see here, we have loaded our home page. If we return on our terminal, as you can see here, we have exactly the object we have built in our server.js file. We have the cleaned path, we have the query string object, we have our headers, we have our payloads, and so on. Okay, at this point, the only things that we had to do to run HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on our server are to create the public handler and to create the HTML templates. Let's get into this. Inside our public folder, we can create all the front-end folders we need to include in our project. So we can create a CSS folder, we can create a JS folder, and we can create an image folder. After that, we need to open our handlers.js file and build a function for our public asset. As we said before, we can grab the client request data from our handlers function by passing a data argument on our function. So we can say handlers.public is equal to async function. Here we want to pass a data argument and open the brackets. Now, before to go ahead and build our handlers.public function, we need to go on our server.js file and include in our router object our public routes. So public handlers.public. Okay, let's save our server.js file. Let's go back in our handlers.public function. And before to continue to build our function, we need to wrap all the function inside a try-catch blocks, because we are dealing with async and await, and the only way we need to grab error is to wrap our function inside a try-catch blocks. So try catch error. If you found an error, console log, console error, error. Okay, so when it comes to serving static asset data, we want that they can be served only by using the get method. So the first check we want to do is that one. So first of all, we need to grab if, we need an if condition, if data dot method is equal to get. Okay. After that, we want to replace the substring public from our cleaned path string, because we want to perform a check based on the file extension. So here we can say let file name is equal to data dot cleaned path dot replace. We want to replace the string public with an empty string, and we want to apply the trim method. If you aren't familiar with the trim method, the only thing that this method do is to delete white space from the start and the ends of our string and normalize it. Now we can check if our file name length is greater than 0. So if okay. After that we have checked that our file name exists, we can take our static asset data. So let static asset data await helpers dot get static asset, and we want to pass here our file name. Okay. This function does not exist yet, but we will build together soon. Now, if exists static asset data, after we have checked that our static asset data exists, we can determine the content type. So basically here we are saying that if our file name contains the extension CSS, we want to set up our content type to CSS. And we continue like this with all the file extension we want to include on our server. So after setting up all our content type, we can return as status code 200. We can return a payload which contains the static asset data, and we want to return the content type that is equal to our content type. We can include in our public folder, in our JS folder, a new file named app.js, and inside our CSS folder a new file named app.css. Okay, I can write inside here some comment. I'm the main JavaScript. Okay, so now before we try to run our enders.public function, we need to build our new function that will take the data from our static asset for us. So we need to go on the helpers.js file and we need to build this function. Let's get rid of this, and we can say here helpers.get static assets is equal to an async function, and inside this function we want to pass our file name. We want to check some condition with the ternary operator. So we want that our file name is equal to type of. In this way we are checking if our file name is a string. So file name is equal to a string. We want to check that our file name length is greater than 0. If all these conditions are true, we want back our file name, else we want back false. Okay? As we said before, we are dealing with async function, so we need to wrap this function inside a try catch blocks. So try catch e console.error e. Okay? We can check if our file name exists. So if file name. Okay. Here we need to declare our public directory. We create a public directory variable. Public directory. Inside this variable we want to store the path of our public folder, but before to do that we need to import in our helpers.js file the path module. So dependencies const path is equal to require path. Okay, and here now we can say path dot join, okay, dir name. The dir name variable is a Node.js built-in variable that gives back to us the path of the file we are working on, and we want to join this with our public folder absolute path. So public, okay. After that, we want to read inside our file. So to do that, we need to use the read file method of the FS module. So we need to import our FS module, so const, but since we are using async and await, so promises, I want to use FS promises. So FS promises is equal to require FS promises. So now we can take the data from our files. Let file data is equal to await fs promises dot read file. As you can see here, this method accepts two arguments. The first argument is the path of the file we want to read, and the second argument are the option we want to use to read this file. Since we are not using any option, we only need to pass our file path. So we can say public dir plus our file name here. After that, we can check if there is any data inside that file. So if file data, we can return file data. Okay, so we can save our helpers.js file and we can go back in our enders.js files. Now, if we want to check if our enders.public function works properly, we need to open a new terminal and start our server. So node Index.js, and from the URL bar we need to navigate to our app.js file, for example, and we can say here public, and here JS, and app.js. And as you can see here, we have opened our main JavaScript file. As you can see here, we can see the comments. If we go on the inspect tool and we open the network tab, reload the page, as you can see here, we get back a 200 status code and we have a content type text JavaScript. So it seems that all is working okay. Now, in order to display some HTML on our website and not only a plain text, we need to change our enders.index function behavior. So let's get into this. As always, we need to wrap this function inside a try catch because we are working with promises. So try catch key console.error. Okay, and we have to check as well as the enders.public function if we have a get request. So if data.method is equal to get. Okay, before we move to build the logic to serve HTML templates, I want to explain what we are trying to achieve. If we look at the basic skeleton we have in all HTML page, we know that we have the head and the header section, the body section, and the footer section. So when we think about how we can serve HTML, we have to think that every page will contain different content. So if we look at CEO, for example, we cannot have the same head meta tag for every page. So we need to build some server-side logic that will do that for us. So first of all, we can create a template data object that will contain all the data we want to dynamically include inside our HTML templates. At the moment, we let this object empty. So let template data is equal to an empty object. Now it's time to grab data from our HTML template file. So we can say let string data is equal to wait helpers dot get template. Okay, now here in this function we want to pass the file name, so index, and our templates data. This function does not exist yet, so we can go to build it together. We need to go in our helpers.js files. Here we can say helpers.get templates is equal to async function, and here we want to pass our template name and our data templates object. We can say data. Okay. Now, as we have done before, we have to check if our template name respects some rules. So we can say template name is equal to type of template name is equal to a string, and at the same time I want to check if template name dot length is greater than 0. If all these conditions are true, I want back my template name, otherwise I want false. Then we need to use a try catch blocks because we are dealing with the promises. So try catch e console.error e. Now I want to check if my template name exists. So if template name. Now we do the same things we have done before with our get static asset. So let's templates dir is equal to path dot join dir name we can say let file data is equal to await fs promises dot read file, and we can say templates dir plus templates name plus our .html extensions. Here we want to pass the UTF-8 encoding type. Okay. So now that we have access to our file data string, we only have to check if the file is not empty. In other words, if data exists inside our file. So if file data, okay. Now, before to return our final string, we have to interpolate our file data string with our data object. So we can say let final string is equal to await helpers dot interpolate, and here we need to pass our file data and our template data. So data. This function does not exist yet, so we need to build it together. At the end of the file we can say helpers dot interpolate is equal to async function, okay, and here we need to pass our file data strings and our data template object. After that we need to check if our string is really a string, so type of string is equal to a string, and string dot length is greater than 0. If all these conditions are respected, I want back string, otherwise I want back an empty string. And I want to check if my data object is really an object, so data is equal to object, and our data object is different from null. If all these conditions are respected, I want back my data object, otherwise I want back an empty object. This kind of check allows us to avoid errors that could block our server. If we take a look at our interpolate function, we can see that this function looks inside our HTML template. In this case is our string, because we are passed our file data as the string inside our interpolate function, and looks inside our HTML template for the key stored inside our data object and replace it with the corresponding value. When we will be able to render some HTML on our browser, we will do some example in order to make you understand better. Now let's go back into our helpers.getTemplate function. So as a final step, here we need to return our final string. So return final string. Okay, let's save our helpers.js file. Now we can go back in our enders.js file and we can continue to write our index handlers. So here we need to check if our string data exists. So if string data, okay. As we said before, each HTML page has the header section and the footer section. So since these sections are common on each HTML template, we can build a function that merges our header string and footer strings with our page's body. So we can say let universal string, okay, and await helpers dot add header footer, and here we need to pass our string data and our template data. This function does not exist yet, so we need to build it together. So let's go back in our helpers.js files to create this function. So helpers dot add header footer is equal to an async function, and here we want to pass our data string and our data object. Here we can perform the same checks we have performed before in our helpers.interpolate function. So we only need to copy these checks and paste it inside our helpers.addHeaderFooter functions. Now, as usual, we need to wrap our function inside a try catch blocks. So try catch e console.error e. And here we can use our helpers.getTemplate function to take our footer and header strings. So we can say let header string is equal to await helpers.getTemplate. Here I can say header, and we want to pass as well our data object. If data exists inside our header, okay, we can get the footer string. So let footer string is equal to await helpers.getTemplate. We can take our footer template, we can pass our data object. Now we can perform the same check we have performed before with our header string. So if footer strings, okay, and now we can build our full string. So let full string is equal to header string plus string plus footer string. Basically here we are composing the total string we want to render on our web browser. Here we have the header string we have grabbed from our header file. Here we have our footer string we have grabbed from our footer file. And here we have our body strings we have grabbed from our bodies. This is the string we have passed inside our add header footer function. If we go back in our Index.js file, you can see that the first argument is the string that we gather from our index template files. Now that we have composed our first string, we can return it. So return foot string. Okay. Let's save our helpers.js file. Let's go back in our Index.js file, and now we can finally finish to build our Index.index function. So here we can check if universal string exists. So if universal string, okay, we can say return. We want to return an object. We want to give back a status code of 200. We want to give back a payload that will be our universal string. Okay, and we want to give back a content type of HTML. Sorry. Okay, now it's all ready to do some tests. So we need to go in our templates folder, and we can create here the header.html file. Here we can create our footer.html file and our index.html file. In our header.html file, we can include some HTML code. Here we can say blog application. Okay. We can also include our JavaScript file, so script. Okay. Here we can say public JS app.js. We want to include the defer attribute because we want that our app.js file will be loaded only when all the page is loaded. And we can link our app.css file as well. So link CSS, and here we can say public CSS app.css. Okay, we can save our header.html. Okay, we can get rid of these two closing tag. Okay, we can save our header.html. We open our footer.html, and we can insert here the two closing tags. So body and HTML. Okay, and we can include also a footer tag. So footer. Okay, and here we can say I am the footer. Okay, and in our index.html file we can insert an h1 title, and we can write inside of it blog application. If we save our index.html file, okay, if we open a new terminal and we run our server, so node index.js, and we refresh our page, okay, we get back an error. Yes, okay, let's try to see what's happened here. Okay, we forgot a forward slash inside our helpers.js file. Here, templates, we need to add a forward slashes because as you can see here, our path is not complete. Okay, now we can reload our server, so node index.js, node index.js. We can refresh our page, and as you can see here, we get another error. Okay, here we have a little typo. So here, content type, we can save. We can reload our server, so node index.js. If we refresh the page, we'd get back another error. Okay, here we have an error because these two lines have to be outside this for loop. So here, okay, now we can save our helpers.js file. We can try to restart our server, node index.js, and we can try to refresh our page, and as you can see, finally we have our web page. And as you can see here, we have all the string we have built on our HTML files. Okay, in the next part of the tutorial, we will build all the blog application feature. If we want to take a look at what I'm talking about, we can take a look at our complete application. If we click inside a post, we can read it here. Okay, and if we search for a word that is present inside the title or tags, we can obtain that post. So for example, here we can say tutorial, search, and as you can see here, we have all the two posts because each one of them contain the word tutorial in its title. If we search for example, only the word vanilla, as you can see here, we have only this post that will appear because only this post contain in the title the word vanilla. If we type, for example, JavaScript, here we obtain only this post because only inside this post we have a tags that contain the word JavaScript. And here we can create a new post by clicking on this button. Here we can upload a new post image, like, I don't know, the Node.js logo. We can receive back a little preview of our image. Here we can insert a blog title, so we can write here, for example, this is another Node.js tutorial. We can write the article contents, so we can say this is a blog application tutorial. Here we can insert some hashtags, so for example JavaScript, Node.js, and I don't know, blogging. Okay, here we can insert the reading minutes, so for example 5, and we can publish our new post. And as you can see here, we have a new post, and if we click inside this post, we can read our post. We can edit this post. Here we have already insert in our input all the information we have inserted before. So if we want, for example, to change this image, we can upload a new image, for example, I don't know, this one. Okay, now that we have uploaded a new image, we can press this edit button, and as you can see here, we have a new image, and we can also delete the post as well. And that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and if you found this content somehow useful, please consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a like to support more content like this. Coming soon, part 2 of this tutorial, and see the next one.